Right, so I'm Jesse. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we do at Timaeus, particularly singular learning theory at a very high level. Look at some particular applications, the ones that we just heard. So let's talk about structure and development in neural networks. I wanted to start with an observation, and that observation is that, well, neural networks work, right? Over the last decade, almost 2 decades, um, well, decade and a half, we've seen that neural networks and technologies based on neural networks have solved many, if not most, outstanding problems in computer vision, in reinforcement learning, natural language processing. Okay, so I think it's a very interesting question to ask why, right? What is it about neural networks that makes them special? Why is this going on now? The way I see it, the key ability of neural networks is that they're able to learn algorithms. Okay, so what I'm thinking of are examples like Wang et al.'s indirect object identification circuit, where they find how neural networks learn to predict the indirect object in a sentence in real-world language models. For example, Neil Nana et al.'s work on understanding how transformers learn to implement modular arithmetic in the setting of grokking. Or maybe older work in vision models that looks at how these vision models learn to compose features in a hierarchical way to understand what's going on in an image. Right, so in all these cases, models learn to form crisp representations of the problem they're trying to solve, and they compute on top of those representations in a systematic way. It's not an instance of a shallow lookup table. That makes neural networks quite unlike earlier learning machines, systems like linear regression, Gaussian processes, clustering algorithms. None of these older methods is ever going to learn how to sort a list, for example. Neural networks, on the other hand, are able to internalize and to reflect the latent computational structure out in the real world. Okay, so what's going on here? What is the nature of this learned algorithmic structure inside of neural networks? Right? In computer science, we have many different ways of talking about algorithms. We talk about Turing machines, Boolean circuits, lambda calculus, finite state automata. All these different models of computation, they're equally expressive, but they're not the same things. So which of these, if any of these, is appropriate for talking about algorithmic structure inside of neural networks? What are the right foundations for AI interpretabilities of proper science? As neural networks continue to get more capable, this question becomes more important. And that's because many of the capabilities that underlie the success of generalist agents out in the real world are fundamentally algorithmic. Things like search, the ability to form plans to steer the world around you to a desired end state, the ability to course correct, to adjust those plans in response to a changing world. Maybe also things like deception, the ability to model the beliefs and intentions of other agents around you and to manipulate those beliefs and intentions. So as models continue to get better, they'll become more capable, and that means the potential both for upside and downside increases. We want to understand what are they doing internally to make sure that they don't do things we don't want. So that's the question that we're going to be exploring today. What is the nature of this structure and how it forms in neural networks? Of course, I only have time to offer a partial answer, and we don't know the full answer yet. So I'm going to get at a starting point for answering this question that comes from singular learning theory. I'll go through the geometric perspective that it offers on learning and the learning process. So I'll start at a pretty high level with some basic intuitions. I'll walk you through learning, what learning is, what singular learning theory is. It's really more of an introductory or pedagogical um, point. And then through the rest of the talk, I'll look at some practical applications of the theory for things you can actually measure in real-world systems and results from recent papers, both including myself and my collaborators. So we'll go through singular learning theory. We'll look at one particular part of singular learning theory, the local learning coefficient, and then we'll look at this application of singular learning theory that we call developmental interpretability. As a bonus, the very end, sort of circle back and make this about safety and alignment again, and see how this might pan out for aligning future AI systems. Okay, so geometry. Well, before we can answer the question of what's special about singular models, we need to understand what a singular model is. Before we can do that, let's start by setting up what learning is. Okay, so learning, well, the definition I'm going to go with, there are many definitions you could go with. The definition I'm going to go with is learning is Bayesian inference. Okay, so you have some hypothesis class, squiggly h, and you have a prior of beliefs over these hypotheses. What you want to do is you want to obtain a posterior, some new distribution of beliefs over these hypotheses in response to data, some data set of n samples that are sampled identically and independently from a true distribution, Q, also known as the data generating distribution. We don't have access to Q directly, only through these samples, and that's the whole, that's the substance of the problem of learning, figuring out information about Q. And the way we do that is through a model, which assigns a probability to each sample given a hypothesis. And by taking the product of those model probabilities over the entire data set, we obtain a likelihood. You put these together and you get Bayes' rule, right, as you see here. And the first change we're going to make to this is we're going to go to a parameterized learning problem. So instead of learning over abstract hypotheses, let's learn in a very practical way over a parameterized model class where hypotheses are awarded numbers. Right. Now, this is going to make it possible eventually to learn, eventually to use things like SGD, where you iteratively update weights to obtain better and better solutions. Now, the second modification is a notational one. We'll find it useful to re-express Bayes' rule in terms of the negative log likelihood. So we've just lifted this L sub n up into the exponent. And this is the negative log likelihood, also known as the loss. Okay, so I'd like to ask you, like, what happens to this equation as you take the number of samples to infinity, take this asymptotic limit? Well, what you'll find is that you take more and more samples, the contribution in the right-hand term is going to be dominated by the minimum of this negative log likelihood. All of the posterior will concentrate around the optimal weights. And so the problem of Bayesian inference reduces to a problem of likelihood maximization. We're only interested now in the point estimate of what the best weights are. And our problem becomes an optimization problem. Minimize this loss over all weights. Okay, so that's learning. Learning is Bayesian inference that reduces to this problem of maximizing likelihoods. Except I kind of lied to you. See, really there are two sides to Bayes' rule. So first is Bayesian inference. It's about updating beliefs over weights in response to data. But the second part is perhaps more interesting and more important, and that's model selection. See, implicitly, there's a dependence here on the model class, the architecture you use to instantiate your solution. If your model class isn't good enough for the problem at hand, then it really doesn't make sense to even try to find the right weights for the problem. In some sense, this is a problem that's more foundational and more important. So how do you do that? Well, as in the case of inference, in the limit of lots and lots of data, the problem of selecting an optimal model, selecting the right architecture, reduces to a problem of minimizing a certain free energy over different model classes. So we've taken the denominator from Bayes' rule, term known as the model evidence, and now we're just trying to minimize the negative log of this model evidence, which is known as the free energy F sub n. So those are the two sides to Bayes' rule, two definitions of learning. Learning as minimizing this negative log likelihood, or learning as minimizing this free energy over different weight spaces. As you can see, we're going to update that definition again in a bit. But first, we'll take our first foray into singular learning theory. So what are singular models? Well, neural networks are an example of a singular model. A singular model is one which satisfies either of the following two conditions. So the parameter function map is not one-to-one. This means different choices of weights can implement the same functions. Or, and or, the Fisher information matrix is not everywhere invertible. That is to say, there might be minima where the Hessian at that minimum of this negative log likelihood has zero eigenvalues. There are directions you can walk along that don't change the loss, or that change the loss by a factor that's less than a quadratic. Okay? As it turns out, this has very important ramifications because a lot of results in classical learning theory assume that models are non-singular. And so when you have a singular model like a neural network, well, a lot of these classic results don't apply to it. I don't have time to go into all of these examples, so I'll just highlight a few. Generalization error for singular models is not proportional to the number of parameters. Intuitively, you should think of simple models as occupying more volume. If you have a simple model, there are more ways that you can perturb it, more ways that you can change the weights without varying the loss, without changing what the model is actually doing at that point. Because of this, it occupies more volume. It's somehow easier to find. It's going to generalize better than other models. The second point is that neural networks don't have a Riemannian information geometry. This is just a different way of saying that the Fisher information matrix has these degeneracies, their eigenvalues. What this means is that if you want to measure the volume associated to some solution, you need more than just the Hessian to do that. You need higher terms in your Taylor expansion in order to faithfully capture the qualitative nature of the loss function at that point, the loss landscape at that point. And lastly, and probably most importantly for us, singular models learn in a very different way from non-singular models. So again, if you have maximum likelihood estimation, if you're learning for a regular model, then what happens with the posterior is it looks more and more Gaussian, more and more spiky in the neighborhood of the optimal values. For singular models, the posterior can jump in a discrete way from one region of weight space to a qualitatively different region of weight space. It doesn't necessarily have to look like a Gaussian. And that'll be very important for us when we start to look at the developmental consequences of singular learning theory for models like neural networks. Okay, with that, we're ready to come back to this question of what is learning? Well, see this? We start by recasting the problem of inference as a variational problem where we're trying to minimize a Bayesian free energy. Now, we sort of already did this, right? We saw that model selection can be expressed as a problem of minimizing a free energy. As it turns out, you can also express the problem of inference within a model class as minimizing a free energy between different regions of weight space. So you introduce some sort of coarse graining. You separate your weight space into different regions indicated by these W's. What you find is that you can express the free energy over the entire model class as a combination of the free energies of these individual components. But then the free energy of the entirety is the negative log sum of the exponent of these individual free energies. And the log sum exponent is a well-known smooth approximation to the maximum function. So minimizing the free energy over the entire model class, or I should say, the free energy of the entire model class is dominated by the minimum of the free energy over these different phases. Okay. So when we're optimizing, when we're trying to find the best solution, when we're doing Bayesian inference in such a model class that's singular, you find is that the free energy has this asymptotic expansion that you see here. And this is the key result of singular learning theory obtained by Watanabe, who is the founder of the field. So we see that the free energy is expressed as this trade-off between accuracy and complexity. In order to minimize this free energy between different regions of weight space, you want to minimize the loss associated to a region and the complexity indicated by this lambda, the learning coefficient associated to this region. This trade-off depends on the number of samples n, right? So as you sample more and more data, this linear term is going to dominate the logarithmic term. And so the model will come to prefer models that are more accurate, even if they're more complex. What's going on here is a kind of data-dependent Occam's razor. The model is implicitly regularizing towards simpler solutions, but in a way that depends on how much data it's seen. It sees more data and it can afford to spend the complexity cost on more accurate fits. So what happens if you apply this idea to regular models, to non-singular models? Well, for non-singular models, this complexity term, the lambda, is a constant. It's equal to the number of dimensions divided by 2. And that's true for all models in a given parameter space, in a given regular parameter space. So minimizing this free energy reduces to the problem of just minimizing the loss, just finding the most likely point. So it's not interesting to take this perspective when you have a regular model. However, when you have a singular model, then this learning coefficient, this lambda term, can actually vary from region to region of parameter space. So that makes this relevant to actually understanding what kinds of solutions you obtain. What's going on here is that singular models perform an internal form of this model selection procedure that we saw earlier. You don't need to compare between different architectures. In a sense, a neural network is already performing a kind of architecture search internally. So we really have these three sides to Bayes' rule. Learning as Bayesian inference, which reduces to the problem of maximizing likelihoods. Learning as model selection, which reduces to the problem of minimizing free energy over different model classes. And learning as internal model selection, selecting between different regions of white space, different phases. Right, so those are our different answers to learning. Maximum likelihood estimation, free energy minimization, internal model selection. And we saw that what a singular model is a model that has degeneracy. There are ways you can change the weights without changing what the function is doing. Okay, so what's special about singular models? Singular models are special because they have algorithmic variety. They're qualitatively different kinds of solutions contained in their weight space. And that distinction, the variety in algorithms or in kinds of solutions they can implement, is reflected in the fact that the geometries of these different regions are distinct. In a very real sense, in order to have a diversity of algorithms that you could learn, you need to have a variety of geometries associated to those different kinds of solutions. And so, as I see it, the key idea of singular learning theory is going to be that the local geometry of the loss reflects internal structure at a given point. You can learn something about where structure is inside of the model, how different parts of the model are connected to each other, what they're doing, by probing this geometry. That's the hope. Okay, but let's dig into this a little further. Dig into this relationship between structure and geometry. So first of all, I just want to make sure because I can't see any feedback. Everything's still going well. Well, you guys can see what I'm up to. That's good. Okay, good. Let's talk about structure. I'm going to talk about one particular link between structure and geometry that comes from the local learning coefficient. Okay. So what is this lambda that we just saw? Well, this learning coefficient has two parts to it. On the one hand, you can see it as a measure of geometric degeneracy. On the other hand, you can see it as a measure of model complexity, an algorithmic component. So on the geometric side, the local learning coefficient measures the volume scaling rate. So suppose I have some toy loss landscape here. I have two parameters, W1 and W2. And the height here, the Z, is the loss associated to different combinations of those parameters. What I can do is I can take some minimum and I can ask, how many solutions are almost as good as this minimum? Under some tolerance, epsilon, what is the area of weight space that is available to me? More generally, this area will be a volume. And what you find is that the volume scales as some constant times epsilon to the power lambda. Lambda is this learning coefficient, the local learning coefficient, in the limit of approaching closer and closer to the bottom, where epsilon is 0. So let me give you a few examples. If you have a geometry that looks like a paraboloid, well, then the learning coefficient is maximal. It's equal to the number of dimensions divided by 2. So 2 divided by 2 in this case is 1. If you have something more interesting, though, something like x to the fourth plus y to the fourth, then the learning coefficient can be smaller. In this case, you find that it's equal to a half. Another more interesting case, if the loss looks like x to the fourth times y squared, then the learning coefficient would be 1/4. Okay, so that's the geometric side. What about the algorithmic side to the learning coefficient? Well, for so-called minimally singular models, the learning coefficient is the effective dimensionality. If it's the case that a given weight doesn't change the function you're implementing, you can set one of the weights to an arbitrary value, and the model still implements the same behaviors, doesn't change its behavior at all. Then it's the case that the learning coefficient will decrease by 1/2. So you can see the learning coefficient as half the effective number of dimensions. But actually, in full generality, the learning coefficient is a more nuanced and exotic measure of model complexity. That's because there are other changes that can also lower the learning coefficient. A change like going from a quadratic direction in weight space to something that's quartic. So we have reason to believe that it captures high-level algorithmic structures such as potentially error correction, maybe modularity. So in general, it's actually inaccurate to think of the learning coefficient as effective dimensionality, or at least misleading. If you wanted to theoretically compute the learning coefficient for a given model, well, it's a bit of a hassle. And in general, it seems to be intractable. It probably is impossible for large neural networks. However, um, it appears to be possible to estimate this. So that's thanks to recent work by my collaborators in these two papers you see here. We've discovered that the local learning coefficient can be scalably and in some cases accurately estimated. Okay, so I'd like to explain how you can estimate it today, right? How you can leave this talk and go and implement it yourself. So this formula is actually pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to take a point, W star, and we want to measure the learning coefficient associated to that point. We measure the loss of the point. Okay, so that's the term on the far right here. What we're going to do is we're going to measure the average increase in loss from that point to points in its neighborhood. And that's this expectation here. In particular, we're going to take this average over a ball centered at W by some radius. And we're going to weight these points according to the posterior. In order to actually implement this in practice, what we'll do is we'll use stochastic gradient Langevin dynamics to estimate this expectation value. MCMZ technique. We take basically an SDD step, add a little bit of Gaussian noise, then sample the loss, then we repeat, sample the loss again, then average the loss we obtain over a bunch of different steps that we've performed like this, and then we'll use that to estimate this expectation value. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to localize. So we're going to make sure that we stay relatively close to our starting point. In general, it's impossible to measure the global learning coefficient, but if you ensure that you're measuring the local learning coefficient, then it does seem to be tractable to estimate it. Okay, so that's this local learning coefficient, this measure of geometric degeneracy, of model complexity. You can estimate it. Still, I think it's a little abstract probably right now, so I wanted to walk through two toy examples in which you'll get a better intuition for what it's capturing. The first are so-called deep linear networks. So these are neural networks without the nonlinearities. And so a bunch of matrix multiplications, what you get out of it is just another linear transformation or an affine transformation. Okay, so in terms of function approximation, it's not very interesting. But in terms of geometry and in terms of the learning process, it does turn out to be very interesting. And what's even better is we have theoretical results for what the learning coefficient should be for these models, thanks to a collaborator of ours, Miki Aoyagi. So we can use this to actually test our estimates and see if they're accurate. What you find in this setting is that increasing rank of the function you're implementing, the transformation you're implementing, is associated to an increase in this local learning coefficient. So the learning coefficient tracks the rank of the learned transformation. As easy as it gets. Well, there's some caveats. The second toy model I wanted to walk through is a toy model introduced by Anthropic known as the toy model of superposition. Particularly, I'm going to be going through follow-up work done by my collaborators, which is shown on the right-hand side here. Okay, so what is this model? The model is very simple. we have a reduced rank affine transformation, you see here, where we map some input vector down into a lower dimensional space and then back out in a linear way. And then at the very end, after we've added a bias, we run the output through an ReLU nonlinearity. And so we're training this in a way where we want to recover the input. That's an autoencoder. In general, you can't achieve perfect performance with this because it's lossy. However, the data that we're running through this model is one hot. So anytime we run an input through this model, only one component of the input vector is active. What that means is that it's actually possible to achieve perfect performance on this dataset. So in the case where we're mapping from 6 dimensions down to 2 dimensions and back up to 6 dimensions, what you can do is you can visualize the columns of this matrix W, and you see that they constitute, well, you can visualize them in 2 dimensions here. That's what's been done here. You see that they describe the vertices of a regular polygon. So the solutions that are stable in this model are regular polygons. And it's possible to actually classify different solutions to predict theoretically what their losses should be, and then to empirically estimate the learning coefficient, and you find that the learning coefficient tracks the complexity of the form. As you go from 4 gons to 5 gons to 6 gons, the learning coefficient increases. And as you start to use more and more of your biases, then the learning coefficient also increases. So here you can see how complex the form is, and you can read it off in the learning coefficient. Okay. So this is a first hint at this connection between geometry and structure. We see that geometric degeneracy corresponds to, well, algorithmic simplicity, right? The more degenerate something is, the more ways there are to perturb it without changing the laws, the simpler the model it corresponds to. Okay, what about development? This is where we're going to start to get into applications. Let me start by introducing developmental interpretability. I want to first argue why taking a developmental approach might be useful even without referencing singular learning theory. But sometimes it's just easier to study changes and to integrate over changes than it is to study individual snapshots. So take yourself, for example. Human beings consist of tens of trillions of cells, hundreds of different cell types, but a logarithmically smaller number of distinct cell differentiation events. Okay, so what we see here is a picture, is a cartoon representing a descent from pluripotent stem cells that go through these differentiation steps to become adult cells. It's a meaningful reduction of complexity to study the transitions between these different cell types. Could the same apply to neural networks? Well, the immediate follow-up question, if you're going to take a developmental perspective, is what's the right unit of change to study? Right? If it's the case that you need to study every training step individually, well, this is not a very useful reduction in complexity, right? You need to be running this all the time, and be very expensive, and not simplify the problem much. In the case of biology, we have some idea of what the right unit of change is. It's something like a differentiation event. So is there something analogous in the case of neural networks? And SLT suggests that the answer is yes. The right unit of change is a geometric unit of change. It's a phase transition, defined in a precise sense. Okay. So let's do some thermodynamics. Right? We have a free energy. Let's look at what happens to this free energy as we vary some of these hyperparameters. So I'm going to take one region of white space, W1 in red, which has a higher loss than this other region of white space, W2 indicated in green. W1 is higher loss, it's less accurate, but it's less complex. So the learning coefficient associated to this region is lower than the learning coefficient associated to this region. If that's the case, then for small enough n, it can be the case that the free energy of this region is lower than the free energy of this region. That's what's depicted in this figure on the right. You see the free energy of these two regions depicted as a function of n for these two regions. As we saw, the free energy of the overall system will be determined by the minimum of the free energies over these different regions. So at this critical value of n, this minimum jumps from being at phase 1 to being at phase 2. We get a first order phase transition. the same sense that we get first-order phase transitions in statistical physics. So SLT predicts that we should see phase transitions in learning, at least in the context of Bayesian learning. So we might expect that we would also see phase transitions in analogous sense in the context of SGD. What you find is that for these toy models that I just introduced you to, development is a succession of phase transitions between different critical points. So here you see for the deep linear networks, the loss goes down in this staircase-like way. The learning coefficient increases in an opposing staircase. And the model reaches these metastable points between different solutions. In the case of the toy model of superposition, you see the same thing here. So here's the loss. As this model transitions from one foregone to a second kind of foregone, it drops down. The learning coefficient goes up in green. And eventually this foregone transitions into its final state, a five gone, and you see one more jump just like that. Okay, so, great. In these toy models, we get clean phase transitions. And what's more, in the case of this toy model superposition, you can actually predict the order in which the phase transitions should occur, and it matches the predictions made by singular learning theory. So it's a non-trivial check on the theory. Okay, but what about more realistic models, right? Real-world systems. Usually, when we're training real-world neural networks, the loss decreases pretty smoothly. Okay, so you don't see this sort of stepwise plateaus pattern when you're training a large model. However, what we found is that if you track the learning coefficient over time, often you find a hidden stage-wise development. So the learning coefficient here jumps between, or it reaches these plateaus, and those plateaus indicate what you might call a developmental milestone that separates different stages, different developmental stages. Now, okay, great. You've got this indicator that tells you that there's a stage boundary taking place. Are these stages real? On further inspection, you find that behaviorally, structurally, there's something coherent going on in these stages. So for a toy language model, the model first learns bigrams, then it learns something n-gram-like, then it starts forming what's known as the induction circuit. It finishes forming the induction circuit, and then it seems to converge to something stable. Okay, so we discovered these stage boundaries in an unsupervised way, and then we went looking for what it could mean and verified that these really are meaningful stage boundaries. So what this is starting to indicate is that, indeed, for neural networks, as in biological systems, you might expect, development seems to be macroscopically simpler than it first might appear. There might be a hidden stage-wise development taking place that can meaningfully simplify the problem of trying to understand what's going on inside of these models. Okay, so what do we learn about structure from this developmental perspective? Well, in some sense, it's something very obvious, right? Algorithms have this discreteness to them. Structure has this discreteness to it. So of course, the way you form such a discrete thing is going to have to involve discrete stages. And what SLT suggests is that these discrete developmental stages will have distinct geometries associated to them. So we get to come back to this question of what is the nature of structure and development in neural networks? The answer is, I don't know, right? And I don't think anybody knows. But singular learning theory is hinting at a deep connection between structure of the model, internal algorithmic structure of the model, geometric structure of the loss landscape, and developmental structure of the learning process. And this is a connection we can use to develop theory, to develop techniques to eventually answer this question. Okay. Where do humans come in, right? Where does our input come into this picture? Well, basically we have two levers to use to control what kind of model we end up with. We control the architectures, we control the data. And the combination of architecture and data determines the geometry of the loss landscape. As soon as you fix the geometry of the loss landscape, then for a given choice of optimizer, you've also determined the developmental process, which is really just, it's not deterministic, but it's close to, it is an output of the geometry, what kind of developmental process you end up with. And if you've determined what the developmental process is, well, then you've also determined what kind of structure you're going to end up with at the end of training. So these are our two controls. I think architecture doesn't matter too much. And I don't think I'm the only one who thinks this. We've seen a wide range of systems that often data seems to be central, seems to be primary. This is an observation that goes back to vision models, right? Many different vision models with different architectures seem to converge to common representations. And here you see an example of that where they developed similar kinds of curve detectors. Here's a recent snapshot, came across my Twitter feed, of models learning to represent cyclical information and in a cyclic way internally. So they're somehow latching onto the structure that's there in the data. There's theoretical work that's been done, again, especially in this context of deep linear networks, where you can see precisely what the relationship is between structure in the data, in the form of modes of certain covariance matrices, and structure of the learning process, stage-wise learning, and structure of the final model that you end up with. And just a few more examples where models learn very crisp algorithms that exist in the world. And of course, they learn structures that couple to structures that exist in the real world. Okay, so maybe structure is really in the data. Maybe we should think of neural networks really as being a kind of antenna, a receiver for the structure that's contained in the data. If that's the case, then there are interesting questions to ask around what kind of structure is in the data. Which patterns in the data are represented deepest in the world? Are those the patterns that also end up being represented deepest in our models? Or are they different ones? Although these questions are still worded very imprecisely, which reflects that we have a lot that we still don't know, I think these are very interesting questions, and very profound scientific questions to start answering. As I promised at the start, I think these are also very relevant questions right now from a safety perspective, from making sure that AGI goes well. That's because at this point, it looks like AGI is coming. Right? You might be conservative. You might say it'll take a few decades, in which case I would say it's still pretty fast. But I'm inclined to think that we'll have systems that routinely beat humans across most tasks by the end, well, within a decade. So, how do we ensure that when AGI comes, that it goes well? With this relentless onslaught of ever more capable neural networks ends up going in a direction that we are happy with. Broadly, I think there are two strategies to ensuring AGI goes well, two technical strategies. So I'm not going to talk about the political and social interventions needed to make sure this goes well. On a purely technical side, I think our two interventions are one, control, right? Monitor these systems. And if you read that one AI system is trying to launch, nuclear holocaust, you just stop it and shut it down. Great, try that. The other technique is to try to align these systems from the start. Okay, so control is about making sure that even a system that doesn't want the same things you want is going to comply and behave in ways that you want it to behave. And then alignment is it's a little more idealistic. Can we make sure these systems share the same values as us, that they have the same intentions we do from the start? If that's the case, then we don't have to worry about monitoring all the time, making sure that there are no cracks in our monitoring systems. Things will work out from the get-go. I think control is pretty difficult for a variety of reasons. In particular, because I think the places where it's most valuable to use AI are places where it's actually hard to control them and it's hard to monitor their outputs. AI systems will be most valuable when we're using them for things where there are few human experts, or maybe no human experts, able to evaluate what they're doing. In many cases, AI systems that are unsupervised, that are allowed to act autonomously in the world without having to comply with some horrible um, Orwellian bureaucracy, are going to outperform the AI systems that we are forcing to fill out a lot of paperwork. So I think at the end of the day, we just need to figure out this whole problem of alignment. We need to make sure that these AI systems share our values. The analogy I like to use for this is one I'll borrow from Daniel Murphy, which is alignment is like aiming an arrow, right? Once we've let go of the arrow, we don't have a lot of control anymore about where it's going to go. We can't course correct once the arrow is flying through the air. But at the start, we have the freedom to choose in which direction to point it. And that's the problem of alignment. Okay. So what's the central challenge of alignment? Well, as I see it, currently all of our approaches to alignment involve engineering the data. They look like modifications of the original training procedure that we use to get these models to learn about the world. And so after we've done pre-training, we get some system that we don't really understand. Um, the question I'd like to understand is, do these techniques we have for alignment, things like supervised fine-tuning, like RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, do they really successfully reprogram the model? Or maybe as depicted in this obviously cartoon image, do they only scratch the surface? Are our changes meaningful? What I'm particularly concerned about is a situation where models go through a significant distribution shift. So suppose we release capable AI systems into the world, we deploy them, and they start changing the world. The world starts to resemble less and less what the world looked like while these AI systems were being trained. So we've undergone this distribution shift. What happens to these patterns inscribed in the model? Which survive? Which break? What happens especially to these superficially embedded patterns? If you have a distribution shift, then what's going to happen is the loss landscape will change. And I'm concerned that it's especially these brittle, non-deep patterns that will get wiped out by such a distribution shift. Concern is maybe there are latent patterns in the data that are deeper than our alignment patterns. Patterns like deception, like power seeking, maybe self-preservation, search, error correction. And that these are the patterns that survive such a distribution shift. So I see the core problem of alignment, and at least in my perspective, as being about understanding how structure generalizes. Okay, so that's the question I would like to leave to you. Now it's your turn. I hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in learning more about singular learning theory, come join the Discord. You can find the link right here, the Discord of our own. You can read the papers. There are more papers coming out soon. And you can try out learning coefficient estimation right now. You can use it on systems you're interested in studying immediately. With that, thank you, and let's take some questions.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much. These are amazing developments that you have in singular learning theory. A lot of the stuff I wasn't aware of, like the new research in it. Uh, I wanted to start with a kind of a simple question. I have like a million questions, but I wanted to start with a very simple one. Could you explain why you believe that these phase transitions are first order phase transition? And
Oh,
what
so
is the
yeah,
equivalent of like latent heat
yeah. So if you take this
capacity?
the Ehrenfest classification, okay. So I'm thinking of I want to draw a diagram. Okay, so in a first order phase transition, the usual image to have in mind is you have some sort of saddle, like a quadratic expression where you've got a double well, right? So you've got sort of two local minima. In a first order phase transition, what happens is the minimum jumps from one of the local minima to the other ones. So you're changing some parameter, and it moves at some point there, they reach parity, and at some point the global minimum will jump from being this one to being this one over here. That's a first order phase transition. A second order phase transition occurs when you, for example, merge the two. So you've got your double well, and you can bring these minima closer and closer together, and at some point they annihilate. You have what looks like a quadratic. So you have only one minimum, or you should say you have a quartic, so you have only one minimum left. So this distinction, whether you are exchanging places or annihilating critical points, is the distinction between first and second order phase transitions in classical thermodynamics.
Thank you. Does anyone want to ask questions?
This is a bit more of a comment, but I liked your framing of control versus alignment as I don't know. I feel like people often have a knee-jerk reaction to alignment is, oh, you're trying to control, you're like regulate. So I kind of like that framing. It's just something I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think control is like the most dystopian thing of it all. It's like one thing I hope is not the case is that there's like a sort of conservation of dystopia principle where like either we're in the Orwellian nightmare or the AI systems are in the Orwellian nightmare. Maybe we can straddle the boundary between those.
Any other? Oh, uh, if it's okay, I'll ask another one.
Mhm.
So there is this framework that has been explored mostly in like geometric deep learning with
Mhm.
equivariant and invariant deep learning, and in there sometimes you have data that obeys certain symmetry, right? So for example, if you
Mhm.
take like scans of, I don't know, like a scans of human hand in
Mhm.
like an X-ray or something, it can be
Yeah.
rotated in different directions, but it represents like the same data. And then the research is to kind of train um, to make the
Mhm.
training process faster by like you know anticipating and eliminating these uh, symmetries. But what I wanted
Mhm.
to ask is that, so in like with Ben Hoover's talk previously, uh, there was like this extended discussion on kind of how uh, the formalisms of many like deep learning models comes from Hopfield networks, and it comes from these frustrated random functions, right? So
Mhm.
we kind of like spin glasses or Ising models.
Mhm.
In there is a degenerate ground state, right? And so um, I was wondering if like this like these singular valleys, or just kind of like um, how do I put this? These like the geometry of the lost landscape at like at ground state is capturing the symmetries in the data, because there is a lot of equivalent. Like if you have a
Mhm.
uh, symmetric data,
Mhm.
then you have uh, like a lot of models that perform equally well. And
Mhm.
I was wondering if there is any connection between those, and like if
Mhm.
like if there is any connection you explored between those two things, and if uh, like what do
Mhm.
kind of singularities represent in this context, if that's the case, because
Yeah.
uh, yeah, sorry.
So, yeah. I've a few thoughts. Maybe I can just like list the thoughts and you can respond to them again. Um, so I had this analogy of maybe neural networks are like an antenna, right? So I don't think. I mean, I think I sort of gave a caricature in this slide where the architecture isn't important. I don't think architecture is not important. It very clearly is important in these cases like convolutional neural networks and equivariate. group equilibrium neural networks clearly are better at latching on to some structures in data than others. Just like we engineer antennas um, to to make them better at receiving signal or transmitting a certain signal. So too, designing architectures is kind of like that. It's about designing these antennas for the data, and that can obviously have a big effect on what you end up learning, how you end up learning. So yeah, there's probably potential to do more there. Um, I'm not going to suggest any ways to do that. The second thing I want to suggest, or come back to, well, let's come back to this example. So where was it? Here. Okay, so the example on the bottom left here is, I think, a very useful example as an intuition pump for how structure in the data and structure in the model might be related, and how symmetries in the data and symmetries in the model might be related. Right. So if you represent the days of the week in a circle, then what's the symmetry associated to that? Well, you can obviously rotate it in any direction. You
Yep.
can reflect it. You can scale it. And as long as you change the parts of the model that are reading from this subspace, from these features, you're implementing the same function. There's a very clear case where you can see that you have this group of symmetries associated to the actual features you're learning that's reflected likely in degeneracies in the model.
Yep. Uh,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe you can now say the question again, because I'm pretty sure I didn't answer the
well,
question.
uh, so um, like I was thinking about like roles of broken symmetries because we can sort of imagine like information entropy as like a counting statistic of broken symmetries,
Mhm,
and I just uh like and I guess complexity, I generally think about complexity as probably like minimal process and consistent with like observed statistic of broken symmetries. That kind of like if you play like yes or no, like 20 questions, right? Every time you give an yes or no answer, it kind of like reduces the cardinality
mhm,
of this permutation group, like where it matters how you order your data.
mhm,
And and so we will like tomorrow wanted to announce one of our program, field called Magora program, where we try to tie this image from statistical physics in spin glasses to kind of algorithmic information theory. So my question is like um, like a lot of this has to do with order and like the order parameters and like the spatial variation of free energy due to it. And that's why I asked this question about the like the first order phase transitions, because like Landau theory has been developed for like second order phase transitions.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. It's a
yeah,
good question. It's a good question. Yeah. Uh-huh.
thank you.
Um, yeah. So I guess this is not my territory, but people I'm working with, Daniel Murfitt, I think, has some ideas for the ways second order phase transitions might also show up um, in in learning behaviors here. Um, so I'm gonna have to. I don't know what the answer is yet, but I think there's reason to expect it. So also, if you look at the developmental biology literature, you look at um, the mathematical literature within developmental biology, what people talk about are bifurcations. We talk about second order phase transitions, not first order phase transitions. So there, it's about the geometry at the transition, not within a developmental stage, but at the boundaries between stages. So it's a slightly different perspective. And it's probably it's a perspective that's probably also relevant for understanding neural networks, and probably also present in neural networks. So I don't know. I think wide open territory.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Uh, I just want to say I really thank you for your answer, and I really appreciate you including like Waddington landscape there. I was also kind of always thinking in these sort of terms, and that's sort of the one of the kind of inspiration for this interdisciplinary colloquium is to kind of learn a lot from these different fields, as you
Mhm,
mentioned, with developmental biology. Like we, for example,
mhm,
there's some kind like sort of simple like a compression that we observe in, for example, in systems biology, where you have all of
mhm,
those crazy parameters, but only few like
mhm,
eigendirections are significant, and they actually get graded at um,
mhm.
uh, like orders of magnitude. Very interesting in many
Yeah,
systems.
yeah, totally.
And 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 uh, so that's the kind of the previous question, like the idea with this, like idea of this equivariant learning being related to this in is that like I imagine that this like generalization uh, and its ties to this algorithmic information is that uh, basically it's like as I think has explored it in a minimal description length. And I remember I think Market mentioning that uh, he he pursued minimal description length, but like abandoned it, or I don't remember what exactly. But could you elaborate on like minimal description length?
I think it's currently still an open question. So we think that there is some sort of minimum description length principle that's applicable to singular models, but it's difficult and yeah, more nuanced than typical minimum description length derivations you see. Because again, when people do the minimum description length stuff, typically they are ignoring singularities and they're pretending that the model is regular. So there's some subtleties. I think there's some difficulties specifically around the fact that you're working in an asymptotic limit for the free energy expansion to hold.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't think there's any principled barrier there. Yeah, let me also come back to the point about yeah, I could have given this talk in a different way and leaned even more, like much more heavily on the developmental biology link, and I think I have in the past. Um, and like you say, there are probably applications of this to other fields to understanding what's going on in developmental biology. And for example, gene regulatory networks, where there's known to be a lot of a lot of degeneracy to
Yeah.
neuroscience, where people talk about representation drift, right? Like the brain learn like the way that the brain represents a solution to a problem, using very learning theoretic terms. The way the brain represents a solution to a problem generally slowly changes and drifts away from the original representation, but the person or the monkey continues to behave in the same way as before. So this is an
Yeah.
exact example of this, the parameter function not being one to one.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and it's sort of more a philosophical point, I suppose. But I think
Mhm,
that in kind of when we do like something I'm really interested in is in unsupervised feature learning and how it like uh, represent like how representations get stored in a network, which is like very much tied with like your talk. But what I kind of imagine is that when, for example, we learn for like the network is able to learn certain or say like not even network, but um like like humans and even animals and etc. will agree on certain like objects, even though like
mhm,
that they kind of exist like there's a chair, there's a lamp, whatever, because they're like rigid in some sense, or and then there's sort of this gradation of the world into these kind of objects that
mhm,
makes description of the world simpler. So we don't have to talk like about how do I put this like
mhm,
and there is also a linked idea where like if we generalize, for example, like a tree, right? Like everyone has this different picture of a tree, but we can agree that those representations and are in some sense like symmetric to each other. And this has been like I wonder if that like geometry of the lost landscape, why they're so similar, why they learn like similar features, is that there is some information theoretic criterion by which there is like these kind of minimal descriptions of kind of the world that uh, that like induce this kind of like degeneracy, because you can like like you can take an object and like rotate it, and it's you still recognize that it's the same object even though your perceptual like image of it is different.
Yeah.
And like that introduces this degeneracy, because you have the same solution to like you take, I don't know, like a chair and you rotate, it's still the same chair but it's a different image, so you have to satisfy all of those, you know. And but yeah, in those, I think the role in this perspective, the role of like singularities, I feel is like, at least to me, is very mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Uh,
I think we're at time. So I will, well, thank you very much, Evgenia and Shikar and the organizers. This is awesome. And thank you guys
thank you
all
so
for
much.
attending.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Jesse.
Excuse me so much. I was wondering if I can ask one more question. Is
I'm happy
it
to
all
if we
right,
have
or
time. You can also
we
send
have
me a
to?
message.
Yeah,
Is
you
that
have
okay?
We have 10
yeah,
minutes.
there's time on you have until 4:40.
Oh, perfect. Okay, sure.
So all of your talk and presentation and the thing that you presented, it's kind of related. And the moment when you spoke about the modular forms and the phase transition is kind of related to my like music toy project I'm working on right now, which is essentially mathematically can be represented as the necklace problems, which is you choose different like amount of elements in a modular space, which will take us your example 7, and we can take say 2 of them, which is 2, and we have some sort of polygons that emerge from this modular space, and you can take 3 up to 7 of them, and for any amount of necklaces you can take any of them. And that is very interesting because in my music sort of research, what I found is like the symmetrical forms sound unpleasant for human ear, and the asymmetrical things, the asymmetrical sort of polygons that you get from these modular forms, they sound consonant, they sound pleasant for a human, they can represent some sort of emotions. That is very interesting, like about the inner groups of modular forms. What are the polygons you can take that are non-similar? So you can extract the rotational symmetry, they will be exactly the same. You can exclude the invert symmetry, so the mirror images of the polygons are not the same. And in fact, maybe there is sort of algorithm to work out the excuse me. You can work out sort of groups and classes within the modular forms that are represent the degeneracies to the smallest possible discrete forms. Like, if you understand what I mean.
So if I understand what you mean, you're saying that when we're trying to align the AIs, we need to look for asymmetrical polygons in the learned representations, because those are pleasant to human ears. And
sort of, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's it. But it's just like an idea, and not less of a.
No.
The
That's
question
interesting.
is more, if do you find it interesting? Did you try to search within the realm of like these necklace problems and the modular
Oh no,
spaces?
this is not a paper that it's not a project I've worked on. It's just a paper that I saw come by. I think it's from Tegmark's group. So I haven't thought very long about it. It just came by and I thought, oh, that's interesting. There's probably degeneracy in that. I think
Yeah, yeah.
I think really I was looking to fill up that slide with more pictures. But it is
Yeah,
interesting. I think there is really something there.
yeah. I suggest you look into that, because it's the fact is, these modular forms, they can be represented as strings of ones and zeros, in like basically as a hypercubes in n dimensions, basically.
Mhm.
And you can see sort of these polygons emerge in the n-dimensional unilateral
Mhm.
n-dimensional
Yeah.
space. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you. I think
Mhm.
that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah, interesting.
The question
I
was,
don't,
if were you looking into that?
that's interesting. No, I don't think. No, we're not looking into that right now. We have other projects working on right now, but yeah, if ever we start to look at these, and I think it's likely we'll start to look at cases like this where you do see clearer structure in an interpretable way. So it's cool.
I have more of a like a social question because there's certain stuff that's attached to this that has like a social dimension, right? Like this idea of like AI interpretability
Mhm.
and social concerns and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of curious, do you guys have like, and this is again more of a sociological question, but do you guys have like a backup plan insofar as this doesn't really work out? And what if you
The
have like
technical stuff is
yeah. I mean, what if you have like, you're actually like working with, large models and then, there's way too many phase transitions or something and you can't really learn anything. There's a lot of examples I could come up with, but it's kind of like, what if it doesn't
Mhm.
work out? And so that's kind of my you're just kind of winging it, maybe you don't have something, but maybe you do. And it's kind of what I was curious about.
Yeah, I think the first thing that a social function that people talk about is buying time. Right? Like if you can delay or give researchers more time to figure out how to robustly align things, and maybe that's the missing ingredient. Maybe these problems are not in principle unsolvable. They just need more time to be solved. Um, Maybe problems turn out to be impossible. Just aligning these systems, it becomes intractable and it requires way too much compute, or there's some other reason that you can't do it. For example, maybe it's the case that past a certain point, neural networks aren't really universal, and you run a bunch of different training runs, and every time models learn a very different internal representation, and so what you learn from one training run doesn't transfer to another case. That'd be a pretty bad outcome for interpretability. Um, yeah, if you find that it's impossible, then I guess a social component that comes into play is maybe stopping things permanently. I don't know if it's, I don't know if that's worth it. I don't know how to do that cost benefit analysis, like about taking that risk if you don't have the guarantees. Um, I don't know. These questions are more difficult than the than the technical questions I ask on a day-to-day basis.
I guess I have an maybe easy technical question for you, but difficult for me. But I was wondering if you had read the sort of two recent papers from Apollo that were on, or at least used
Mhm.
singular running theory. It's a bit too dense to
Yeah.
be parsed. I was wondering if you have any like high level thoughts, what your first impressions were of them. I can post them in the chat.
Um, yeah. So I think the work's cool. Um, yeah, like, I'm super excited to see that Apollo is excited about singular learning theory, and I've been happy to talk to Lucius and see this manifest. Um, I think there are a few places where it's too uh, conservative about singular learning theory. Um, what do I mean by that? I think there are a few sentences in that, which is like singular learning theory in its current form is not appropriate for neural networks, and I don't know if we necessarily need the modifications they propose. Yeah, so I think that's it. But yeah, it's very very cool. And it's you know what, the way I sort of see that is it's a line of research where one thing you could try to do is just enumerate all the degeneracies that are possible in a neural network. If you start looking at you start looking at the equations, and you can find a few examples where maybe you can rotate something in like you can rotate what comes after the embedding as long as you apply the inverse rotation before each attention blocking before each MLP. You can do certain things with a ReLU, for example. If you ensure that the bias of a ReLU is very minimum, a very small negative, then you're always going to be in a negative regime, and anything you pass through that ReLU will be mapped to 0. So that induces some degeneracy. You can come up with a bunch of examples like this where you actually count the number of degeneracies. And in this case, you can actually do it. So I'm excited to see Lucius and Apollo like actually looking at the kinds of degeneracies that occur in neural networks. Cool. I think we are actually at time this time. So I will thank everyone again and wish you a pleasant rest of the weekend.